This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Jeff Whitworth, K-State crop entomologist, kicks off today's show by reviewing crop insects he is seeing and hearing more about this year than in recent years. Today, he talks about the sunflower head moth and green June beetle. Master's student at K-State and Nebraska Extension educator Anastasia Meyer continues the show as she shares key points from her thesis that researched 25 years of land value changes in Kansas and Nebraska. Ending the show for today is K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk as he discusses best practices for increasing the rate of pregnancy detection in the dairy herd between now and the beginning of fall. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show talking about crop insects with K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
Good morning. My pleasure.
Jeff, wanting to talk about the sunflower head moth, something you're seeing more of this year than you have for quite a few years.
Probably for the last 5 or 6 years, we have not had much of a problem with sunflower moths or sunflower head moths, as they're most commonly called. The head moth and the alfalfa weevil, prior to 5 or 6 years ago, as I said, used to be the two severe pests we had in Kansas. Alfalfa weevils on alfalfa, sunflower head moth on sunflowers. What that designation means, and if you were going to try and raise alfalfa or if you were going to try and raise sunflowers in the state of Kansas, you had to consider treating for one of those pests because they were just that prevalent, they were just that common every year. But in the last 5 or 6 years, at least before COVID hit, the alfalfa weevils continued to be a severe pest, but not so much the sunflower head moth. Now, remember, when I talk about a pest, I'm talking about over a wide area of the state. It can be a real problem in a field here or there, but not over as large areas as it used to be. So the sunflower head moth, we're not sure if they overwinter in Kansas. I really don't think they do, but that's irrelevant. They show up every year. They still are showing up every year. They migrate in. The first times we've seen them probably a month ago in the state of Kansas. So they migrate in, and they'll have 3 or 4 generations a year, depending upon the weather, after they get here. They really, I don't know how they do it, but they really find heading stage sunflowers.
How could people maybe manage this pest?
The management of the sunflower head moth has been pretty well developed over the years, but not really well refined, if that makes sense. By that I mean they've developed pheromone traps that work really well. The pheromone trap, you can deploy that around the sides of your field, and that will attract the moths. So when they're first here, they are attracted to the pheromone for mating purposes, and that will identify when the moths actually are flying. That's important because that's when they're actually laying eggs. So it's important to the stage of growth of the sunflower also. As I try and beat into everybody, it's all about timing when you're looking at managing an insect, a pest, whether it's a pathogen or whatever. It's mostly about timing. So in the case of the sunflower head moth, if you're trying to grow sunflowers and you have year after year, you're well aware of the head moth and the kind of damage they can cause. So you deploy the pheromone traps. Once the pheromone traps start catching moths, and the moth is a little tiny white, they describe it as a cigarette or cigar shape because the wings kind of roll around the body a little bit, and they're pretty just little white nondescript moths. Once you start catching them, they're pretty easily identified from anything else you're going to see in a field. So once you start catching these moths, that's the time, in my mind at least, to go out and start sampling your field or start monitoring your field. You don't need to do that beforehand, and the folks that actually sample sunflowers will really appreciate that because sunflowers, especially when they're heading, they're no fun to sample. They're spiny and sharp and stickery, and it's just no fun walking through those fields sampling. But be that as it may, once you start catching the moths in the pheromone traps, we recommend you go out at night with a light and start checking the heads of the sunflowers. The head moth, as the name implies, will be on the heads, and they're nocturnal, so they'll be out there at night. They're laying eggs on the heads. Now, the nice thing about the sunflower head moth at night, they're white, and the head, the seeds are kind of a dark color, so they're easily illuminated in your flashlight or your headlamp or whatever you're using. So you go out at night and you start counting head moths. Once you get 5 or 6 per head, that's the time when we would recommend you treating. Now, a lot of times we have recommended once you start catching the adults in your pheromone traps, that's the time to treat, because there is usually a lag time between when you're realizing you're catching moths in the pheromone traps until the time when the applicator can get out there to actually treat the field, and they're laying eggs this whole time. So keep that in mind. But if you're out checking, which again we recommend, at night, you got 5 or 6 moths per head, they're laying eggs, that's the time to start thinking about treating immediately. If you got more than that, you're probably a little bit late. I say that because the moths are laying eggs, they lay eggs, and then as soon as those eggs hatch, and it only takes 3 or 4 days, what you're really trying to do is kill the moth before the eggs hatch or before they deposit the eggs, or kill the larva just as it hatches out of that egg. So that's why I say timing is really critical for the sunflower moth.
What damage happens after the eggs hatch?
So as soon as those eggs hatch, those larvae go into the seeds or into the head, and they'll crawl down and they start feeding underneath the seed or in the seed, where if you spray it at that time, the insecticide just won't control it. So that's at that point in time, it's too late to treat. So what we recommend is you do that. Now, if you don't want to go out at night, you can go out during the day. That's why I say a lot of guys, when they first start catching the head moth in their traps, they treat. They don't want to go out at night and start, monitoring and sampling at night. But if you don't, you can go out during the day. The head moth is nocturnal, so they're hiding during the day. As you're walking through a sunflower patch, you'll see these little white moths fly up. That's probably the head moth. Especially if there's a pretty good infestation. That's about all you're going to see flying around out there. And they'll fly from one leaf to another or one plant to another, and they'll get underneath the leaf or they'll get down in the foliage. They don't go to the head for the most part during the day. It's mostly at night when they're up, depositing eggs. The moth itself doesn't really feed. That's the stage we're really trying to control, or just as those eggs hatch, just before those larvae bore into the head. Once they get into the head, they really cause a lot of damage. 5 or 6 years ago, we'd have 100% of our fields infested with head moths if you didn't treat. I don't know what has happened in the intervening years, in the last 5 or 6 years. I don't know if they're going to start coming back, but this year I've gotten several calls about fields that are having head moths where they haven't for the last 4 or 5 years, or areas of the state, mostly in the Midwest part of the state where the sunflowers are grown. So be aware, once these larvae get into underneath the seeds, into the head, they're just going to feed, and they're going to cause that head to turn to mush almost, and they ruin the seeds. I have seen anywhere from 3 or 4 larvae to 100 and some larvae per head. And if you got anywhere between 30 and 40 larvae per head, you're not going to get any seed production out of that head at all. So that's why it's critical to get out when these moths are first flying, because unlike most other insects, we're trying to control the adults before they lay the eggs, or just as those eggs hatch, because as soon as they hatch, those larvae are gone, and you're not going to get them with an insecticide application.
Jeff, wanting to mention another insect you've been seeing more of, the green June beetle in corn?
Yes, we've had the green June beetles flying for probably a month or so now, but just recently I put out some insecticide trials in sweet corn that's just now silking, and I've never seen green June beetles attack corn silks like they have in these plots. This is in the central part of the state. And I know green June beetles have a wide host range, so they'll feed on apples, oranges, whatever's around. But in field crops, it's the silks and the leaves of soybeans that we worry about. Right now, a lot of the silks, a lot of the corn's too dry for the green June beetle to worry about, so they're into soybeans. But I do have some major sweet corn producers. I say major. To me, the guys that take sweet corn to farmers markets a lot. So they are feeding on the silks. They're worried about whether that will actually reduce the pollination. And in the plants that I've looked at just recently, the beetles are feeding on the silks. They're clipping the silks. But when you open it up, the plants are already pollinated. So I really do not recommend treating for green June beetles unless those silks are just now being produced and they're up there, just brooming those silks back to nothing, because those plants are really, really, really good at catching that pollen and pollinating despite the presence of adult corn rootworms or adult green June beetles, Japanese beetles, or whatever it is. Yes, they're big. They're up there, and there's a lot of them in these fields. But right now, everything I've seen is already pollinated, so they're just not going to do any damage right now. Maybe late planted, or maybe if they move from there over to soybeans. But right now, there are a lot of green June beetles around. They're in the newly silked corn, but the ones I've seen have already pollinated, so really not anything to worry about as far as yield goes.
Jeff, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some information about sunflower head moth and green June beetles.
Sure, my pleasure. Anytime.
That was K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. If you'd like to read more about crop insects in Kansas, you can do so by finding the Crop Insects in Kansas book by going to the K-State Research and Extension bookstore at bookstore.ksre.ksu.edu. I will link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and to continue our show today, we're talking about land values for the past 25 years with Extension educator in Nebraska who has recently completed her master's in agribusiness at K-State, Anastasia Meyer. Anastasia, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Anastasia, first, congratulations on completing your master's. And before we take a look at just these past 25 years, first going a little bit farther back and looking at what land values were for Kansas and Nebraska in 1870 and 1880, respectively.
As we know, land values have increased at a really high rate of inflation. In 1870, when the first census of ag was done in Kansas, the average land value was $13 an acre. The average land value in the most recent census of agriculture for Kansas in 2022 was $2,579 per acre. In Nebraska, it started out at $10 an acre in 1880. They were 10 years later doing the first census. But by 2022, their land values had increased much higher than Kansas to 4,409 values. So I wanted to look at what was driving these rates of increase, because the USDA also reported in 2022 that Kansas farm real estate was increasing at a rate much higher than any state in the nation. It was increasing at a rate up to 16.3% from 2022 to 2023, when the other Great Plains states was increasing at a rate lower than 13%, and the rest of the United States at a rate much lower than the Great Plains.
As we're talking about land values, also wanting to make a mention of how ethanol and wind turbines maybe impact or don't impact land values.
So part of this research was I had to look back and see what some of these factors were and what other researchers found for their research projects. And we know net farm income highly affects land values. We know the productivity of the land affects land values, as well as farmability. When I looked at wind turbines specifically, if you live near a wind turbine, you always hear about how they're going to bring down your land values. But there's multiple studies out there that show that there's no effect on land values from a wind turbine. Ethanol plants have a higher effect on basis and corn price. than it does in land values. So in effect, it kind of does have a small effect because you get higher payments for corn per bushel. You're going to be able to have a higher net income, and therefore land values are slightly affected, but it has no direct impact on the land values, just on the corn basis. Really, the biggest thing that we found when researching the things that affect land values is going to be water. People want the access to water. They want to be able to irrigate, and they're going to choose that more than a highly productive piece of ground that has better soils on it.
When did you see this largest increase in land value for Kansas and Nebraska?
Both had really large increases in land value from 2017 census to the 2012 census. During this time, we had a steady rise in commodity prices from 2008 to 2014. It was a great time to be farming. Net farm incomes were great. Kansas as a whole increased 79% higher in land values. Nebraska actually doubled in land values and prices, and they increased 105%.
And what about for the census that happened just after that one?
So then we did not have high commodity prices. We had falling prices. We had droughts in 2012. Kansas actually was more affected by a drought in 2011 as well. Despite the low income and the lowered commodity prices, there was still an increase in land values at the 2017 census. Kansas had an increase of 13%, and Nebraska had an increase of 16%. So this was one thing that did not follow the trend in my thesis, and this small increase when everything else was decreasing is attributed to cash reserves. Cash was really driving these land values, and the ability to have that cash on hand kept the values high, as well as the cattle prices were still good at this time, and it was causing pasture values to still remain high. So those two effects kept the land values from declining and still had a very small increase in land values.
While talking about these land values, lumping the whole state together, however, knowing that eastern Kansas is very different than western Kansas, and is that the same when we look at Nebraska?
Yes, so it's going to be, as we expect, the northeast part of Kansas is going to have a higher rate than something like the southwest corner. The land values are going to be different. But up until 2007, most of the Kansas agriculture statistic districts, people call them crop reporting districts, but they were pretty close in value up until 2017. And that is when the Northeast District really shot up and went crazy high compared to the rest of the state. The East Central also increased as well. And, this is going to be attributed to the better soil quality. It gets rain, and the population. There's some good population there. And the effects like urban sprawl couldn't be seen in land values here.
Anastasia, as we look at the land values for these states, why are there such differences in these land values?
The water ability. People want the access to water, and Nebraska lays over the Great Plains Aquifer or the Ogallala Aquifer. So they have that ability to irrigate, and they can use the land that maybe should be pastured, but there was no irrigation abilities, and they can grow crops there. That's probably the biggest reason why, is that ability to irrigate.
And Anastasia, while we're thinking about land, something really important to a lot of farmers and producers, stepped up basis.
Part of my thesis was to create an index value using the Census of Agriculture data and as well as the survey data. Now, I had to use both of these because the Census of Agriculture data is only done every 5 years and is a very thorough. Every single county has a value assigned to it. The survey is done on an annual basis, but there's no county level basis or land values attached to this single year survey. So part of my research was to create an index value using each one of those to create values for the county level. Right now, we do have a tool on K-State that has a stepped up, or it uses just a sensing survey values to figure out what the basis of your land might be if you inherited it years ago. However, it doesn't break it down into counties or even regions. It only goes by the state. And depending on where you're at in the county, you could be way off in value. So I use those two figures and I created these values, and it's going to be really beneficial for the people who inherited land years and years ago to find out what the value might be for in their county. Let's say you inherited it in 1970s. Maybe you cleaned out somebody's house and you don't have that paperwork anymore. You can use this to figure out what that basis might be if you wanted to sell your land. Nebraska has an inheritance tax, so Nebraska is a little bit different, that they have to have the inheritance tax should match what their stepped up basis would be. But Kansas doesn't have that. So if you were to sell something and you didn't have that documentation, what values do you use? And just a little background too, the stepped up basis is very beneficial for people who have these highly valuable pieces of ground, machinery, stocks, anything like that. So if you inherit something, let's say Dad bought the ground in 1970 for $500 an acre, and you inherited it now, and let's say the fair market value is $7,000. You wanted to have nothing to do with farming. You wanted to sell the ground and maybe buy a house or something, but you didn't want to farm. You could sell that ground after a year of owning it, and instead of paying capital gains tax of that $7,000 minus $500 if your dad was to sell it, and have capital gains tax of $6,500 an acre, and then your tax rate depends on a couple different factors. If you inherited it, your new basis value would be $7,000. So it's a much better capital gains strategy if you are going to be passing on the farm, or if you want to sell it, or if your kids want to sell it. It's something that people who are planning estate plans need to think about.
As you've spent a lot of time around land for your thesis and looking at the different values, anything you'd like to encourage producers to do?
Yeah, so land is a large portion of anyone's balance sheet, and it has a lot of emotional attachment to it. So if you are going to be inheriting land soon, I really encourage you to think about getting an appraisal done on your land, because it's going to be beneficial for you in the future. And we're going to see a large transfer of wealth in land and other assets, especially in the farming community, as the average age of the farmer increases. So it's hard to think about when you lose a loved one and you inherit a piece of ground, but one thing to think about is getting an appraisal done on your piece of ground.
That was Anastasia Meyer, who's an extension educator in Nebraska and recently completed her master's in agribusiness from Kansas State University. Her thesis is titled A Quarter Century of Change, Land Values in Kansas and Nebraska from 1997 to 2022. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you ahead.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. It's fairly common for dairy producers to experience a decrease in the efficiency of breeding cattle during the hot summer months. However, to improve breeding efficiency, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk encourages producers to conduct weekly or at least bi-weekly pregnancy checks. He says this reduces the time it takes to discover which cows are still open or did not settle.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the effects of dog days of summer on your dairy herd. I know you've probably been watching that bulk tank go down slowly as we've experienced more summer heat. However, one of the most important things that happens to our dairy herds during the summer is actually a reduction in our efficiency of breeding cattle. It's not that you or your technicians are doing anything wrong. It's just heat stress has a pronounced effect on the reproductive cycle of our dairy cows. I know many of you utilize hormones to bring animals into heat, and even during heat stress, we generally continue to try to utilize those same techniques. However, heat stress is causing cows' body temperature to rise, so that makes these products less effective as we try to get cows pregnant. The result you see is a loss in conception rate and fewer pregnant cows in your herd. This results in more open cows. We know this happens every summer. However, as we look at this summer, some things that you might want to change up as you go into fall. Number one, how often do you preg check your herd? Our very aggressive herds, when they're looking at breeding efficiency, are doing preg checking on a weekly basis, for sure every 2 weeks, rather than once a month or maybe not even that often. So if you have a longer interval in between checking for pregnancy within your herd, that means it's a longer interval until you discover which cows are still open or which cows did not settle. This is going to reduce your breeding efficiency. So as we move out of the dog days of summer and we move into early September, and hopefully your corn silage harvest is past and you maybe have a little more time to focus on your dairy herd, might be important to focus on the reproductive side of the herd. So again, if you've been long intervals in between pregnancy determination within your herd, considering doing it more often, at least every 2 weeks and maybe even on a weekly basis, so that we quickly determine which animals are still open. Once we have a list of animals that are still open coming out of summer, you need to make some decisions. Some of these animals may be fairly long in days in milk. In this case, do you really want to get her pregnant, or do you want to look for a replacement for her in your herd? That would mean that we would need to either have heifers, or we would have to supply a replacement animals from another source. Again, with the reduction in available heifers, might be more difficult to find a source of heifers to bring into your own herd. But there are still some bargains out there to be had. Now, for those animals that you're going to continue to try to get pregnant, you need to consider how you're doing it and maybe how to shorten up the interval once you find her open. Again, more frequent pregnancy checking will help with that. It's also important that you consider going to a short sync program so that if she is found to be open, she can be bred quicker. Rather than waiting 2 weeks or more, you can get that down to a few days. As we exit summer, I want you to make sure that you've taken time to determine the pregnancy status of every animal in your herd. And with those open animals, make the hard decisions that you need to make as you move forward, so that open animals can either be quickly pregnant or they can be replaced with other animals that you might purchase from the outside or from replacements that you already have on hand. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to increase their breeding efficiency during the summer by increasing their rate of pregnancy detection.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.